Have you ever tried to do exploratory data analysis in a project and gotten stuck on questions like, how do I know how far into this analysis I'm actually supposed to go? How do I know if I'm looking at the right things or even taking the right approach? And now I have 10 tabs open in Excel and a bunch of SQL queries. How do I actually make this make sense to someone else? What if I told you there's probably one main thing that you're skipping that would transform all of these questions from confusion to clarity? Today's video is episode 4 of our Portfolio Playbook series, where we're going to be diving step by step into what that one thing is and also the initial framework for doing that first layer of exploratory data analysis. If you're new here, I'm Christine. I'm a former data director and a hiring manager who now helps people take the most direct path to working in data through my mentorship program. And on this channel, we share the strategies, the frameworks, and the mindset tips to stand out as a data analyst. Let's dive in. So the first video in this Portfolio Playbook series introduced the idea of the READY framework, which is the framework I use to create a job-ready portfolio project, which stands for representative data, exec-driven questions, analytical frameworks, data best practices, and your insights and your impact. Now, all of the elements in this framework are going to translate directly to things that we use on the real job. We're not going to focus on really advanced technical functions that we never use or Kaggle projects that have no real business context. In this case, exploratory data analysis is one of the most important skills that you need to be able to have, especially if you're transitioning into the industry, because it is the backbone of what we do on the job, which is understanding how to use the tools as a cohesive system to surface the questions that stakeholders are actually curious about and translate those into meaningful insights, even when the question is very ambiguous. The number one thing that you should always do in the beginning of any kind of exploratory data analysis project is to do requirements gathering. Requirements gathering is the antidote to getting lost in exploratory data analysis. This is where you narrow in on the scope and get very intentional about what the deliverable should actually be. Most of the times, stakeholders are asking data people questions that belong to a few key buckets. There's overall trends. So for example, what are overall trends in sales or any metric? Conversion rates, product adoption, patient claims, growth rates. So what are monthly and yearly growth rates in any of those metrics? Performance measurement. How is the loyalty program performing? How are our marketing programs performing? How are our new product features performing? And what should we actually do about it? And KPI reporting. So what were our refund rates over the last few months or average order values over the last few weeks? Notice how all of these questions can be ad-libbed with whatever metric it is that you focus on in your industry. So if you can understand the big buckets of the questions that we get asked on the job, you can be more confident that your knowledge will apply across industries. We'll start with a pretty classic analytics question, which is, what were the overall trends in sales? This is the kind of question that you might get on the job. You might bump into it in an interview or a take-home assessment. And so if we start out with that question, what are the things that we want to clarify or gather requirements on, either with our stakeholders or define for ourselves in our portfolio project? When we're clarifying the metric, when we say sales, are we talking about revenue? Are we talking about profits? Are we talking about average order value? Or are we talking about order counts? In clarifying the dimensions, what categories do I actually want to slice this question by? I'm sure we don't want to just look at what the total sales dollars are. If we want to understand what the trends are, we're going to have to dig one level deeper and slice it by different categories like time, region, country, product, or different demographics of the user. For the deliverable, who are the stakeholders that are actually going to use my analysis, and what's the context that they're going to use it in? Now, it's not common that stakeholders will actually know the answers to all of these questions on the job, but the more you can actually define this and hash it out with them up front, then the more intentional the direction of your exploratory analysis will actually be. We actually did a role play in my live cohort last week where we went through the process of requirements gathering. And so we started out this question of how did sales look over the COVID years? And then I was the stakeholder in this situation where I was an operations manager. And as our cohort members were going through the requirements gathering stage with me, that question then became, how did total sales revenue perform across products from 2019 to 2022? Conduct some initial analysis and create 2 slides that will be presented to marketing managers, product managers, and finance managers in our team meeting next week. Do you see how the first version would lead to analysis paralysis for anyone, whereas the second one gives us a much more concrete direction for our exploratory data analysis? So initial EDA isn't about really deep dive insights. It's just about getting a lay of the land. In your first few hours, your goal is just to understand what's in the data and spot any obvious trends or patterns or anomalies, and also get a sense of whether or not it can even answer your stakeholder questions. Now, the A in READY stands for Analytics Frameworks, and you guys know I'm all about the acronyms here. So the framework I want you to remember for initial EDA is SCAN, which stands for Stakeholder Goals, Columns and Coverage, Aggregates and Anomalies, and Notable Segments. Stakeholder goals are what decision is this analysis actually supporting? What KPIs and dimensions matter the most? Columns and coverage, so what data do we have available and how can I use it? Aggregates and anomalies, that's what are the high-level metrics, the summary stats, the outliers, and maybe any obvious patterns. And notable segments are where we start to actually slice by a category, like time or other key dimensions, to surface some early insights. The more existing domain knowledge you have, and the more you layer that into your portfolio projects, the more insightful and nuanced those projects will be, and the more they'll stand out. By the way, since so many people have been asking, I'm launching a self-paced version of our live cohorts. We're going to be able to access the same 12-week roadmap that helps people transition into a job in analytics. So if you want to be a part of the first group to get access to it, sign up for my newsletter below. So let's see SCAN in action and actually apply this to our game zone dataset and do some initial exploratory analysis. We had cleaned the data, and so now we have this orders_clean table, and I also cleaned the region dataset. So I have a region_clean table. And here it's just best practice to never actually delete your data if you can help it. So that's why I've moved everything over to a clean tab. And then you can also notice that in the actual clean tab, I use _clean to signify the new cleaned columns. Eventually you could actually overwrite the original columns if you're really confident that these are the clean values that you want to go with. But for right now, I just let them in so that we can see both sides of it. If you want to refresh on the data cleaning steps that I took, just check out the data cleaning video in this portfolio playbook. Now, in terms of starting the actual analysis, the framework that we had, the SCAN framework, is going to help us not get super overwhelmed. What I recommend is creating an insights log where you actually start working through each part of the SCAN framework. So for example, the initial question, how did total revenue dollars across all products perform during 2019 to 2022? Conduct some initial analysis to help product, marketing, and finance managers understand high-level trends. So I'm actually just going to note this thought process down in the insights log so that I have a direction to keep coming back to. So let's focus on the S part. There's no direction being made as of yet from our initial question or the definition of this project. So we're going to focus on high-level trends and patterns. And the most important KPI is going to be USD price. Now, we're just going to be using the USD price, the product name, and the purchase time columns. So when we want to look at the total USD price across months, products, and look at the averages and all that stuff, one of the most important tools that we're going to use is pivot tables. Now, pivot tables sound very basic, and a lot of times people are like, don't we do more advanced analysis on the actual job? Yes, we do, but pivot tables are one of the most commonly used functions in Excel. I would say about 60% of the time I'm doing some kind of analysis in Excel, I'm still using pivot tables. So let's practice this and go to our clean data set and start piecing together the averages and the totals across the different months and across different products. So I'm going to insert my pivot table here. And if I want to look at the monthly USD price across all of those years, then I know I'm going to want to create columns of months on the left-hand side and then the total USD price on the top. So I'm going to drag that over here. Now, Excel likes to do this stuff where it tries to help us out by bringing in other like time grains whenever we add time to a pivot table. So I'm just going to get rid of that because you usually want to flatten the table so that you can do calculations off of the pivot table without like subgroups being in there. Now you'll notice that even though the question really didn't say we want to know exactly by the month, I rolled it out to the monthly level because this usually has a lot more detail than just showing it on the yearly level. Showing on the yearly level would usually cover up the nuances of the seasonality. So we want to be able to see that, especially when we're looking at trends by product. So I'm going to use monthly level. Hope you guys can hear the sirens out here right now because New York is always very loud. But here is the total USD price by row. I can see that we've made $6.1 million and the average ranges from, well, the total of USD price ranges from 100,000 to about, let's see what the maximum is, like 500,000 per month. Because I wanted to drill down into product, I'm also going to bring product into the table. I could put it in rows or columns. Let's see what that actually looks like. When I put it into rows, if I think about the structure of this table, what it allows me to do is see the top line number for every single month and then the breakout by product. However, if I want to look at trends by product, this is actually not really a helpful view because I can't compare the progress of one product within itself from one month to another. So if I bring product over into columns, then the structure of this table helps me see a lot more clearly how a product has trended over time. So this concept is a very light kind of intro into data modeling, which is the idea of how you actually shape your data for your analysis and as input to your visualization tool or to, whatever the next step of your analysis is. And I think it's much more helpful to have the product on the top, the month on the left-hand side, so that I can see how within every single product, not only how the totals compare to each other across products, but also how a product evolves over time in terms of its sales. So now comes the fun part where I actually stare at what I'm starting to make and pull apart some of the findings. So I'm just going to format this so that I can read it a little bit more easily and report some observations. We know that total sales is $6.1 million, and it looks like per product, it ranges from $800 all the way to almost $2 million. Now, there are certain products that obviously perform much better than others, right? So the gaming monitor seems to be the top one. The Nintendo Switch also seems to be the top one. So those are all things that I could start to note in my issues log. I'm actually going to go a step further and start visualizing what's going on here, but I'm not going to make any graphs yet. I'm going to do a very simple thing of conditional formatting, which is where I'm going to create a heat map on top of all the numbers so that I can much more easily see the patterns. Now, one thing that you should keep in mind as an analyst is anytime you create a table, do you need to go straight to a graph? Or can you use something as simple as conditional formatting to help tell that story before you go into the whole visualization stage? Again, this is just doing these kind of practical steps for you to start telling the story of what's happening. So I'm going to add in conditional formatting here. Notice that I left off the grand total because that would have really skewed the color formatting because the grand total is obviously always the highest. The way that I did conditional formatting here allows me to compare products to each other and also lets me see if there are certain popular months. So let's start talking about what we're seeing. Well, first of all, the gaming monitor, the Nintendo Switch, and the PlayStation bundle are all the most popular products, clearly, in terms of sales, in terms of the actual dollars that they're making. And it seems like there are certain months that are also pretty popular. So in terms of seasonality, December 2020 seems to be like there was a peak at that time in terms of total sales. January is when things start to get a little bit lighter each year, right? Compared to the holiday months. I'm just comparing the cells, like what color they are to the color above. And the gaming laptop, the gaming mouse, and the gaming headset, they're all really low compared to how much money those other products are making. In my insights log, I'm gonna note the tab that has that relevant analysis so that eventually when I start making more tabs, I can still remember where the heck I saw that insight. I'm gonna note down what is the metric and the dimension that I'm actually looking at, what is that key finding, and I'm also gonna think about who is the relevant team that this insight might be helpful for. So one of the first insights that I'm going to note is just what those total top line numbers are. So what were the total sales across all those years, and what is the range of total sales across each month? So the tab that I'm working with, I named it Pivot Table 1. I'm just gonna note that there. And USD price and I guess month is the dimension that I'm looking at. My main finding is, let's go back and see what it is. So 6.1 in total sales. And then the range is anywhere from, what's the minimum here? The range is, well, this is not right. It's $21, but this is just messy data, right? This is just for when we had a purchase timestamp, I think that was missing. And notice here that I'm just leaving the unclean data in. It doesn't really affect my analysis, right? I do not need perfect data to start getting some insights. So I think the range is anywhere from 80,000 to 550,000. So I'm gonna note that down. Total sales across 2019 to 2020. 2022 is about 6.1 million. We can always get more exact when we actually put this in a write-up, ranging in monthly sales from 80K to 500K. And the relevant team here, this requires a little bit of imagination. You can always use ChatGPT to help you here if you're not sure, and just be like, who is a team that would care about this on the real job? Is probably the finance team, because they want to track what those high-level sales numbers are. I'm also going to start looking at the aggregates per product. So I'm going to look at, for the top performing products, what was the range of total sales? And for the lowest performing products, what was the range of those sales? That will give me a sense of the difference between the best products and the worst performing products. So let's see, the gaming monitor is the highest performing one at 1.9 million. And the lowest performing one is the gaming headset at just $800. So it looks like there's also possibly a lot of missing data here. We're not really sure. So that's something else that I'm going to note down in my insights log. Now, in terms of patterns, I also noticed that the worst performing categories are all within the category of the headsets. So that might be something to note and look into. And in terms of seasonality, I am seeing that December 2020 seemed to have a pretty big spike, and it's actually around the fall months and the winter months that seem to also do really well. So I don't know if there's any promotions being run around that time, or if it just has to do with the holiday season or the school season starting up again, but that would be something to look into as well. The next thing that I could do is start to visualize it and put it into graphs. But there is something that we could do before we actually go through the exercise of creating a whole line graph or bar graph and formatting it and making it look nice, which is using spark lines. Spark lines are what I call baby line graphs. They're basically very minimal line graphs that help you see the overall dips and values and trends without the scale. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight that, and again, I'm going to ignore that top row because that's actually a row that has a missing date. It's not useful for us. And I'm going to insert spark lines. So we're going to go insert here and then spark lines. And I'm going to pick to place the spark lines right under it. Now when I expand this, I can very quickly start to see what those trends are in a different way. What are the insights that are coming up here? I can see that about halfway through our time range, so I guess that's 2020, there was a huge spike in purchases across the board. Every single product actually has this story, right? Even the lower performing ones. So the gaming laptop, the mouse, the mouse just came into the picture in 2020, but they all have this big spike in 2020. I'm sure we can make some hypotheses on why that is. And I can also see that the grand total follows a trend that really closely is mimicked by the gaming monitor, the IDEA pad, and the Nintendo Switch. What this tells me is because the pattern happened across all different product categories, that this might be a macro trend or something that was affecting the company overall. So I'm gonna start noting down some insights here. So do you see how I'm trying to give this data set a bit of shape and overall understanding where I could relay the story of these numbers to someone who's not really in the numbers day in and day out? Now, in terms of notable segments, this is where I'm going to actually deep dive into other dimensions and start bringing in the story about how this distribution of products and the averages and the sums and all the different aggregates that we look at actually change by different dimensions. So if we look at regions or if we look at different customer demographics, how does that story then become more rich and more nuanced? So I'm going to leave that for the next video in this series where we're going to be diving into how to bring other dimensions to your analysis to make it more insightful and nuanced. And if you've been working for a few years and you want to pivot into a data role, but don't know exactly how to do that and want to work with me with live mentorship, then check out my mentorship program below, and I'll see you in the next one.